Okay, welcome to JOMC 161. This is the beginning of our introduction to HTML and CSS. This lecture is your introduction to HTML. I know you've been going through Code Academy, but there's a few things that we want to make sure that's covered here that may not be addressed very specifically while you're learning actual HTML code. So just real quick, some definitions. The first being URL, Universal Resource Link, which is the text string that specifies a specific document on the web. Some people call this URI, and in fact if you look at the W3 standards, URL is now deprecated and you're supposed to use URI, but it's pretty much ingrained in everyone's mind that URL means the same. What that means, everybody uses it anyway. So the next one is homepage, and we're all familiar with what a homepage is. It's the beginning or the first page that loads of a website or a collection of web documents. Now, the interesting thing and the thing to note about the homepage of a website is that it always must be named index.html. Your other pages, they can be named whatever you want, but the homepage always must be named index. And the reason for that is that the browsers are programmed to look for a page called index.html. They look for a file when you type in a URL, www.google.com, the browser looks for, at that domain, a file named index.html. If it doesn't find it, it most likely will return some form of error. If it finds it, it loads it, and that's the homepage of that particular website. Now we all know what a web browser is. It's a client for navigating the web, and there's a bunch of them out there. Firefox, Safari, Explorer, Chrome are the most popular ones. And those, the most used browser is constantly changing. Chrome is raising its share, and Explorer is falling. Safari's sort of just kind of sitting there. Firefox is getting more popular, or maybe less popular now that Chrome is becoming more popular. So then we have also HTML, which is the language that we use to compose documents for web delivery. And if you remember back from the introduction to the World Wide Web lecture, HTML is the base layer of the levels of richness of user experience for the web, which in basic terms, HTML presents the content for the website. HTTP, and these are two terms that are not to be confused, HTTP is the language or the protocol used by web servers, hosts, and clients to deliver and request documents that can be either web pages or script pages, CSS pages, files, images, anything that can be displayed within a web browser. So the structure of a HTML, here's sort of a visual representation of the difference between HTML and HTTP. HTML is the language of the document that a client requests from a server, and HTTP is the language that those two computers use to talk to each other. So an HTTP session is the process of a client browser going out, requesting an HTML document from a server, and the server responding by sending an appropriate document to the client. Now, HTML is not a programming language. It is what we call a markup language because it is simply text plus the markup. And here's some examples, and you've seen these already probably, paragraphs, headlines. Basically, you're marking up the content with the appropriate tags to define what type of element it is for the browser to display. So it is not a programming language, simply a markup language. There are a couple ways to prepare HTML documents. You can edit them by hand, which is basically typing in your code within some form of text editor. Note, you should not use a word processor like Word because that is not designed to output the right type of files to become web documents. So you want to use a basic text editor like TextEdit, Notepad, and then some other slightly more complicated ones. Komodo Edit is one that we use. There's one called Coffee Cup. There's one called BB Edit. There's a bunch of them out there, and you can just Google those to find a lot of different options. If you're using a text editor to write your code for HTML, you would use a browser like Firefox or Chrome to preview and check the work as you go. The easiest thing to do is you simply keep the file open in the browser, and as you save, you click reload in Firefox and it updates with the newest saved version. The other option you have are using authoring tools, or WYSIWYGs, which stands for what you see is what you get. And basically that's how those are. They're sort of drag and drop. You can drag things around on a stage or a document, and then the program writes the code to display what you're building. Adobe Dreamweaver would probably be the most popular choice for a form of WYSIWYG. Dreamweaver can function as a basic text editor too, and then there is some danger if you move things around, it'll create. The problem with using WYSIWYG authoring tools is that they create messy code. They create very specific code and heavily notated code, and can really cause some problems when you're trying to go back and edit something later on, or if somebody else comes in and starts to maintain your site. Plus, usually messy code and heavily notated code creates larger files and takes longer to download. So some of the idea behind HTML layout is that the control is given partially to the builder, partially to the viewer. The builder marks logical elements of a document, such as paragraphs, headings, images, lists, all those things that you've been learning HTML properties HTML elements for. But the user at the end controls exact presentation by how their browser settings are set up, how their browser options are defined, and how big their window is. We talk a little bit about mobile devices. Mobile browsers are different than computer-based browsers, desktop or laptop-based browsers, and so the windows must resize to fit different screen sizes. Text wraps, other elements can wrap, and so the user does have that ultimate control over what a website looks like. And so really the question is, how much control should the author have? Another thing to note, and this has been talked about, certain elements in HTML are case sensitive, so be cautious when you're using capital letters. File names and extensions are case sensitive, directory names are case sensitive. W3 demands lowercase HTML tags in XHTML and HTML5. So now the technically HTML tags are not case sensitive, but the W3C insists that they should be. Just a bit of history about HTML. This doesn't go back all the way back, but starting with HTML4, which is really where the web was kind of based on, we have the next version is XHTML, which sort of strengthened the rules for HTML and made it so it required a lot of extra things to happen for that code to be valid. XHTML required all elements to be closed and all attributes to be quoted. It was a little more picky. And there were two categories of XHTML: transitional, which was used to transition old coded pages into the new standards, and then strict, which would have been used for brand new pages that were built within the XHTML version. And that really did enforce the separation of structure and presentation, moving the presentation aspects to CSS pages. And if you remember from that, levels of user richness, the CSS is the presentation, and in the middle. The middle level would be the CSS. And then of course we have the newest standard, not yet the standard, but the newest version of HTML, HTML5, which has essentially the same rules as XHTML1 strict. It is a little more relaxed when it comes to some of the rules. And it also includes new element tags like header, nav, footer. Some of these tags are simply tags that were used as IDs, and so they decided to just include them as elements because it made sense. And then we have a link to an HTML5 reference on the W3 Schools website. HTML tags. So let's talk a little bit about HTML tags. Tags indicate the start and the end of an HTML element. So there is a difference between a tag and an element. There are 5 HTML tags or HTML elements actually that are required on every HTML page to be valid. The doc type, an open and close HTML, an open and close head, open and close title, and open and close body. So if you don't have one of those, your page is automatically invalid. So make sure when you're building an HTML page that you include the doc type statement and those other 4 HTML elements. And those are the basic elements. So anatomy of an HTML element is, we have several parts of the element. The element is the whole thing from open tag to close tag, or start to end. So your tags would be, in the case of this first element, the paragraph, open, and that includes an attribute. So you always have attributes. If they exist within an HTML element, the attribute must be in the open or the start tag. And the attribute is basically consistent of 2 things, the attribute itself and then a value. And the attributes always must equal something in quotes. So your attribute of class equals a value of indent in quotes. Then you have your content. Then you have your end tag, which is your closing tag for the element. Some elements are self-closing, such as an image tag. An image element has a start tag, has attributes to define the location of the image, and the attribute of alt to define an alternate if the image is not available or not loadable. By the way, the source and the alt are the 2 required HTML attributes for a valid image element. And then the end tag. There is no close img. There's just a close and a bracket. So this is actually one bracket containing element. So it's a self-closing. It's also called empty because there is no text content. There is technically no content, although technically the image is content, but there's no content within the HTML itself. So those are the parts of HTML elements. Now, types of HTML elements, you've already kind of gone through some, so we'll just kind of quickly highlight some of these. Headline or headings are one type of block elements. Sorry, I should back up. There are block elements, inline elements, and empty elements. Block elements define a block of content or a box, and they always want to start their own new line. You can force them to be inline, but by default they're going to want to start their own line. So you have headings, you have paragraphs, you have lists, divisions, and those are just some examples of block elements. Those are the primary examples of block elements. Then we have inline elements, and there are a lot more. Inline elements are a little more complex because anchors are in there, but you have style tags such as strong and bold and emphasis for italics. You have images, which are technically inline elements. They also can be classified as empty if you define empty as not having any text content. And then links. Links are anchor elements, and they're defined with the open anchor, close anchor tag, and there can be a variety of information within those close anchor and open anchor tags. The primary information that you're going to see in a link tag is an href attribute followed by typically a link to, or a URL to a web page or a website. And we'll talk a little bit more about types of href values that you can use. One of the alternate href values you can use is an email anchor or an email link. You can set it to mail to a specific email address, and then that becomes part of the anchor, and that becomes what the anchor does when you click it. You can use text in an image. Excuse me. You can use text in an anchor, or you can use an image in an anchor. If you want to use an image, you simply put the image tag in place of text between the open anchor and the close anchor. And anchors can link to just about anything, any document on the web, PDFs, HTML pages, script pages. You can link to email addresses with mail to. You can link to IDs within the same document. So you can do something like return to the top link at the bottom of your page to link back to the very first element on the page. And just sort of as a side note, href is commonly thought to stand for hypertext reference. There are a couple types of link href values that you can use, and the href values point to usually another document either on the same website or on a separate website. And there are two different types of links that you can use depending on where you're pointing. You can use what's called relative, and relative link locates a file in relation to the current page that you're currently looking at. And so that would be applicable if the page that you're pointing to is on the same folder structure, is on the same site as your current page. Here are some examples of an image that has a relative path to an image, an anchor that has a relative path to an image or a HTML page, and then this is a relative path that includes a double period at the beginning. The double period directs the browser to move out of the current directory and find the file that's being named after the slash. So the first word here is typically the name of a directory or a folder, and then a slash, and then the name of the file that you're looking for. So if your file is buried within 2 or 3 folders deep, you would have 2 or 3 folder names separated by slashes, and then a slash and the name of the file that it's looking for. This only works if the content exists on the same website, so in the same root folder, on the same domain. If your file exists on another website or another domain, you have to use what's called an absolute URL, and that's a fully qualified URL. That's a full HTTP ://www domain, whatever, and then the folder structure / file name to get to the file that you're looking for. And those typically all look the same, and you can always recognize an absolute URL or an absolute path because it always has to start with HTTP. If it doesn't start with HTTP, it's not an absolute URL, and it's either wrong or it's relative. And those are the basic two. Now within relative, you have what's called root relative, and that's a sort of an uncommonly used path type. It's used when the href value is relative to the website root. What that means is that if you want to start again, it's basically telling the link, we're starting from the root level and then going to this folder structure. So you start your value of the href for the source with a slash, and then you put the file or folder series in there. So this would be starting at the root level, we're looking for index.html. That's what a root relative would look like. So just a real quick exercise, what is the root folder in this structure? Not exactly something you can interact with, but this is the root folder. mydomain.com is the name of the root folder. And the reason that's the root folder is because it contains all the files associated with that particular domain. So all of the HTML files, all of the CSS files, all of the images, the JPEGs, and the folders that are associated with that website exist within that particular folder, which makes it the lowest level or the highest level folder, the root folder. and we'll skip that. And then talking about the last type of HTML element, empty elements. They're empty because they do not contain textual content, and there aren't very many of these. Line break, or the BR tag, horizontal rule, and then the meta tag are the most commonly seen ones. The meta tag is simply a tag placed within the head of an HTML document, and it provides information about the document. Usually the char set is in a meta tag, and that tells the browser which character set the page is using. The meta basically is metadata about the document. Really quick, let's talk about attributes, and it looks like we've got some text running into each other on this page. Attributes always equal something in quotes, and they always go within the open tag of an HTML element. And there's a lot of different attributes. Some are required. For instance, in the image element, the alt attribute is required, the source attribute is required. Some are simply necessary. For instance, in a link tag, you really can't have a proper anchor element without an href. And then there are some attributes that are optional and used for identification. ID is an attribute that's used to identify a specific element. Class is an attribute, and this is really bothering me. There we go. Class is an attribute that is not a unique attribute, but it's used to identify an element, and it can be used to identify multiple elements on the page. That's the real key to the difference between IDs and class attributes. And let's swap this back. See if this is going to work. There we go. Now it works. So some other HTML elements that really don't fall into any of those categories, comments. Comments are basically hidden tags and hidden text within a document that the end user can't see. The doc type is technically not a tag, it's a declaration. It declares to the browser that your HTML conforms to a specific HTML version. And the W3 standards require every page to have a doc type declaration. The old version of the UNL website had an XHTML 1.0 transitional doc type. Here is that doc type. And then, of course, the new UNL website, the current UNL website, has an HTML5 doc type, which is much simpler. It looks a little bit more like this. Actually, it looks exactly like that. We'll come up here. There we go. All right, so this is my website. And if we look at the HTML for my website, you can see that the doc type is this right here, which is just HTML, which means it's an HTML5. Now, validating HTML is very important, and it's something that we'll spend a lot of time on, kind of spread out over this course of this class. We validate to W3C standards. Typically, you would use an online validator because the online validators can be updated on a regular basis to include new standards, new HTML elements or tags that might show up in the standard. Because remember, HTML5 is still a prototype, is still a non-standard in development language. So there's still things that are being added to it, being modified and tweaked. And you can use web validators to check your code against the standard and make sure that it is correct. It's a good tool for debugging. It helps you find errors in your code. And there are some tools that allow you to do a number of other things. For instance, the Web Developer Toolbar in Firefox allows you to view HTML source. It allows you to look at the CSS. It allows you to validate both HTML and CSS. And let's take a real quick look at what have the validation. This is actually the Web Developer Toolbar right here in my Firefox. And so I have tools here that allow me to validate CSS, validate HTML. So let's go in, and I know this page doesn't validate, but we'll do it anyway. And we have 34 errors. They're all of the exact same error. bad value shadow box. It does not like the shadow box, and so it gives me an error every time it sees that value. It gives me one error, and this is a goofy one. Anyway, but it tells me now I have 34 errors within this HTML document, which allows me then to go down through the list and say, okay, line 41, I have a bad value go to. Line 42, I have a bad value go to. And all of these are bad values, which I will ignore because I know that the page works without those being valid. The other thing I can do is I can validate my CSS. So let's validate that. And I have a bunch of CSS errors too. Partially because I'm using CSS level 3, and this is validating at a CSS level 2.1. And it'll tell you too then, it says, okay, this doesn't exist in level 2.1, but exists in 1, 2, and 3, which, how does that make sense? 1, 2, and 3. Property border radius doesn't exist in CS level 2.1, but exists in CSS 3. And we can go down this list and say, okay, all of these exist in CSS 3. RGBA does not exist in CSS 2.1. We know that, which is fine. I can ignore all those because I know I'm using CSS 3. And I wonder if I can fix that. Somewhere there is a way to change my validator preferences. CSS level 3. So if you go in and I can try this one here. So CSS level 3, we'll just do this. This is another way to validate without actually having the toolbar. So this is the jigsaw.w3.org website. This is your CSS validator that's online. And actually the web developer toolbar uses the CSS validation service to do it. So if you go to this website and check your website this way, it's the exact same process as if you go through the web developer toolbar. So I'm checking, and now since I'm validating now at CSS level 3, everything is fine, no errors, and I'm good to go. Some of the other things that this toolbar is useful for is I can view the source, which just allows me to view the HTML source. It allows me to view CSS. It actually allows me to play with the CSS, edit the CSS, and it turns it off. So I can come in here, and here's my CSS for the page. I can come in here and I can edit this and make this, maybe 100 pixels, and then it adjusts whatever that element was. Video rollover. Oh, it won't. That's not really a visible thing. Okay. So we won't mess with that. But it's an option you can do, and you can take any website and do this. You can mess with it and see what happens. It's very useful for when you want to try something out and see what CSS is doing to the page. So that is the web developer toolbar, and we can. So why validate? What's the point? Well, like I said once before, it's a great debugging tool. It helps you find your HTML errors and your CSS errors because it tells you what line they're on. It tells you the syntax around them. It tells you where to find those errors. It's a good way to future-proof your site. As future standards are developed, the current standards will be incorporated into those future standards. And so if you write to the standards now, your standards will be kept for future versions of HTML and CSS. It makes maintenance easier. If somebody else comes in and starts editing your site for some reason, if you're working on a company website, somebody else may come in and have to do some work on it. If they're familiar with the valid HTML and you're familiar with valid HTML and the site itself is valid, it's easier for them to make changes. It simply teaches good practices. It leads to more complex quality concepts like accessibility, and it is a sign of professionalism. And those are some of the very basic reasons. There's probably a lot more. Making sure that things work on your website, making sure that things show up when they're supposed to, or link to where they're supposed to, and then adding the web developer toolbar in Firefox. It's an add-on. So you have to install it, and we can talk about how to do that in class. So that is the lecture for the introduction to HTML. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in class.